Design.
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 Design means to plan.
Human.
Substance.
Technology.
Designing for a better future.
What is design really?
Let's talk about design.
Making an impact in the world.
The power of design to improve life.
Design to survive.
Over the past decade, we've seen some of the world's most powerful movements emerge. From the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, Me Too to the climate strike. The past year, however, has birthed a renewed form of activism. A world tipped into what feels like a permanent state of unrest has shed a light on the vast inequalities that many previously ignored. From systemic racism to gender-based violence, civil liberty threats to environmental neglect. A fire has been lit in the bellies of the masses, now angry, demanding answers, poised and ready for a revolution. But how do we bring about change when those wanting to maintain the status quo maintain the most power? How do we fight for justice when it's met with such unjust consequence? Technology has given rise to a powerful digital playbook for activists to share, unify, and mobilize. Clashes in the street unfold alongside virtual debate. Faces and actions are immortalized, shared and reshared again. Terror into tweets, hardships into hashtags, and solidarity into a sea of black squares. But while technology has brought activism to its most powerful, it's made its trajectory grow more complex, unpredictable, and dangerous. It's harnessed by those with the most influence, from politicians to media empires, dynasties to billionaires, to forward personal agendas and undermine efforts for equality. Digital surveillance remains at an all-time high, and just as quickly as a voice is heard, a voice can be silenced. What does the rest of 2020 hold for activism? And will it finally mark the dismantling of global systems built to only benefit the few? Welcome to Can Design Save Us, a series exploring design as a pioneering force for good. We dive into the most pressing problems of our time and meet people using design to solve them. We explore the good, bad, complex, and controversial. My name is Lesley Price, host from the Index Project, and my guest today is Bahrain's Esra'a Al Shafei, celebrated human rights activist, blogger, and founder of Majal, a digital platform for amplifying underrepresented voices, promoting diversity, and protecting social justice. For over 12 years, Majal has built platforms that creatively amplify marginalised voices, from migrant workers to the LGBTQ+ community. Esra'a is also the mind behind Index Award 2015 finalist, CrowdVoice. So welcome, Esra'a, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I have to ask, how are you and the team coping under COVID-19? I know that you guys are based all over the world, but has it been made work more difficult?
For us, in terms of operational challenges, we have not really experienced anything different because we have all been working remotely for at least 15 years. So that part of the work has not been disrupted at all. However, there were significant challenges when it comes to fundraising because a lot of our fundraising were tied to travel, were tied to speaking engagements. We couldn't have in-person meetings, which was rare anyways, but it certainly helped to have that option available, that when we do raise funding, we can have an in-person strategy meeting, for example. And of course, a lot of the people that we work with have been severely impacted, whether it's migrant workers or members of the LGBTQ community or other underrepresented and marginalized members of our societies have been heavily impacted by COVID-19, either financially or in terms of mental health or in terms of their jobs. Or even in terms of their actual persecution levels that have drastically increased since the crisis occurred.
How did your journey of activism start? I know you've been doing this for, say, 15 years. Was there sort of a one light bulb moment, or was it sort of a series of events that, pushed you into activism?
For me, it was a series of events. It was micro moments where I would experience or witness a human rights violation, often against migrant workers, where this was a very prevalent issue in Bahrain. and growing up in a society where you can't speak about injustices, you're not encouraged to speak about these injustices. There were not a lot of forums and not outlets where you can explore what you can do. That was a very traumatic experience for me, because it meant that also I was complicit. My silence was complicit. The fact that I was gaining from what these migrant workers were doing. You know, they were building our homes, our schools, they were cleaning our roads, but there was nothing that I personally felt that I could do to relieve the situation. And I think it was not until the internet, when I explored it, did I realize that that was actually going to be the weapon with which we could fight for our voices, but also for the voices of others, making sure that they are heard and that they have their own narratives and agencies, and making sure that we feature their stories in their own voices. And I was never able to do that with anything other than the internet.
CrowdVoice was a finalist in 2015 for the Index Award. Just for those people who don't know, it's a crowdsourced digital platform that curates valuable media, such as data, videos, images on movements and protests all around the world. It's a really great way to stay informed on issues from an on-the-ground perspective without getting too overwhelmed. Now it's 10 years on. Its mission has been fulfilled, as you guys say. Can you tell me a bit more about CrowdVoice?
Yeah, I mean, when we founded CrowdVoice in 2009, there was an incredible need for it. There was a lot of people who needed CrowdVoice because we were sharing information only by email. We were sharing information through a multitude of different avenues. And it wasn't being curated in one place. So even when we were exploring and working with journalists, they kept saying, could you share more media? Could you share links? How do we verify this? Is there other places that we can go look for information? And that's really where CrowdVoice was born. We wanted to create a platform where we could curate information. But more than that, we also wanted to put that information in perspective and in context. So aside from the fact that it was an archive of videos, of information, of media, links, and where people could also upload directly their own images and their own videos, we also enabled the crowd to moderate it. You didn't have to sign in for security reasons. Anybody can go and become a moderator on this platform. And I think that was really what where a lot of communities felt that it was something appealing to them, because they could use the wisdom of the crowds to curate, to moderate, but to also contextualize a lot of this data. So CrowdVoice really celebrated that informed advocacy that I think is so absolutely crucial in effective movement building. And I would say that it fulfilled its purpose because after a decade, the internet, the state of the web has completely changed. And people now do have other places, to kind of do this type of work. I would say still, there isn't a platform that does exactly what CrowdVoice does. There's a lot of places now where you can actually collectively curate and crowdsource and moderate information and verify. There's a huge movement for disinformation out there, but none of them still, do the backstories, do the timelines, do the infographics, which was an extensive amount of work, but it was also an essential, an integral part of CrowdVoice and what made it different. So for now, primarily, we feel that we fulfilled its purpose because we have 12 years worth of incredible, rich content and data that people can go back to and really understand what happened in these years across a whole range of global social justice movements.
With founding CrowdVoice and Majal, of course, would you call it a mother organization? Did you find that Western media wasn't covering the issues in perhaps the frequency and the depth that you think people needed?
Absolutely. Oftentimes you see one headline, people are protesting in India, there's not a lot of context. They would pick maybe one or two shocking videos and leave it there. And then people move on. And then people get oversaturated with that information because you see something, but you don't quite understand it. You just know that it's happening, but you don't know since how long. You don't know the key players. You don't know how it connects to other conflicts around the world or other issues. You don't know what civil society and organizations are doing about it. You don't know how to help, how to get involved, how to learn more. You also don't know how to engage with the content. Oftentimes, the media will say, this is the video, take it or leave it. At CrowdVoice, it's, this is the video. Can you help us verify it? Is it true? Is it not true? And oftentimes, people really enjoyed the fact that they had a say. And we never really experienced major issues when it comes to opening up the platform for other inputs, because people tend to stick with their own expertise. People from Yemen would verify videos from Yemen. People from Bahrain would verify videos from Bahrain. We didn't really see a lot of people attempt to game the system, which is actually much more prevalent today, and why we couldn't also continue. Because today we live in an age of deep fakes. We live in a place where propaganda has really started spreading in innovative ways because governments are spending so much money on it. And for us to go up against that, it is a significant challenge. But I mean, yes, I would say.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about deep fakes and everything just being online these days. As an activist from Bahrain, and you've kept your physical identity a secret, how difficult has that been when basically everything is on the internet these days?
It has been really difficult, but it would have been more difficult if I started my journey to anonymity today. I started it at a time where there wasn't, Twitter was not huge. Facebook was barely, being formed at the time, where there wasn't, Snapchat, TikTok, all of these other services, Instagram. There wasn't a celebration of all the selfies and put yourself out there and document every aspect of your life. A lot of people back then used the internet to seek information, to engage, to write content, rather than to just share and share. Even in the past, when you go to YouTube, to be a quote unquote YouTuber was not really a thing. People went on there to listen to music or to watch trailers or to, learn how to cook a recipe or something like that. But I never remembered that when you go to the front page of YouTube and you see endless videos of people attempting to launch a career, and some have done that successfully, no matter where you are. India has its own YouTubers, Russia has its own YouTubers. Everybody, there's the culture of where the self is the main, brand. And in the past, this was not really the case. So my journey to anonymity was not very challenging. It was very easy because people didn't expect me to share. People expected me to just, create the blog, create a website. None of the people, we had thousands of authors in our group blog. None of them had photos online. None of them ever posted anything even remotely personal. We never knew what the other people looked like. When we had calls on Skype, nobody would have their videos on. It was not a big thing. Now, when you're in a call or something, people say, "Oh, your video's off," or "I can't see you," and it's an expectation consistently. So, and now we have facial recognition. People have their cameras and their surveillance, and they're encouraged to do that. And for me, it's very frightening because when you look at how governments are spending money on surveillance, infrastructure, and techniques, it's becoming easier and easier. And now they don't have to spend even that much money because all they have to do is mine the information from these existing services, which either sell it to them or they don't have a secure enough back end. So they end up hacking it and stealing it anyway. Or when you delete your picture, it's not really deleted, as in the case of Facebook, for example. So, it is a terrifying time to fight for your privacy and your anonymity.
I also like the idea that when you go to speak at events that you have people's undivided attention because they're not allowed to have their phones with them to take pictures.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This made a complete difference for me. I feel when I see the difference between how the audience engages with a different speaker, they're not laughing, they're not, reacting, they're not showing any sort of emotion because they're checking, their emails or they're live tweeting something, or they're really distracted. And it's easy to be distracted because you have all of these windows open and everybody is vying for your attention. Even if you're offline, somebody online is vying for your attention. They're pinging you nonstop, whether it's your colleagues. And now as the work culture shifts remote, it gets even worse because people are thinking that they can go to an event, but they can also not take a day off. So they're also on Slack and they're on all of these different collaborative softwares and they're trying to do their work at the same time and check their email. But as soon as when I come up on stage and people say, "Look, this is a sensitive situation and you will need to put your devices away," first of all, they react with shock. Wow, but this is a tech event or this is a human rights event. It's visibility is the most important thing, but not really. Sometimes it's very important that you do things in the back end, on the grassroots level, where your face is not your identity or your brand or your movement, And you see that today we love attaching a name to a movement, whether it's Greta with climate change or Malala with the right to education. And then that becomes a very personal struggle rather than an actual movement. So there's definitely pros and cons. I mean, definitely, yes, there's inspiration that comes from that. But then when we're stuck to this, we're also ruining these people's lives, because then they can't do or say anything without feeling like they're in the limelight and that they represent the movement at large, and that other people don't feel like they have a say in it. Other young people, especially those who are from diverse backgrounds.
I mean, it's interesting that we talk about this oversaturation of media. And of course, the internet and social media has been a massive enabler for freedom of speech and activism. But in terms of the problems, we hear this term slacktivism thrown around, where people basically post on social media about a certain issue and think their work is done. Do you think this is a major problem?
It's an absolutely major problem. And in fact, it has only gotten worse with more social media. Now people say, for example, sometimes even with funders, you go and fundraise and you say this is, for program expense. And they say, but you should invest it in TikTok videos because all the kids are there, and just do short videos and try to. But that doesn't really, it doesn't really solve the problem, the root case of the problem, whether you're dealing with racism or classism or the normalization of slavery. These are really deep themes and issues that a simple TikTok video, for example, is not going to help, And the other thing is that people think that sometimes a tweet or a series of tweets, they've done their jobs. And I can understand, that it's important to be outspoken. And when you have no other avenue, of course, you're going to go to social media. But that definitely shouldn't be the only outlet. And I think we're all capable of doing a lot more than that. So I think that is important to highlight, because social justice advocacy is not a weekend project. It's not a commitment that you can make in a series of tweets. It's a lifelong commitment. And you change so much about yourself to make sure that when you look back at your life, you know that you've done your absolute best. And when you look back and you say, well, I tweeted about it in 2016, I think that's sufficient. I don't think you will be able to convince yourself that you've actually done something to, progress your society, or to bypass a challenge or something like that. I think people will want to look back and say, were you persistent and were you consistent when it comes to this? Where you are faced with challenges where nobody listens to you, and instead of saying, well, nobody listened and I'll move on to something that people will listen to, you go back and you try to find other ways to make your work heard. And you don't have to have millions of followers for you to be a very good advocate. You could be working within your society. You can have the ears of very influential journalists and, work with communities and do community building. And community building and community engagement is actually decades and decades worth of work. It's not something that we can do on a summer holiday. It's something that this is every year, your movement might grow by a couple of people, by a couple of dozen, maybe a couple of hundred. If you're very lucky, thousands, hundreds of thousands. But in those rare cases even, it's important that we encourage other people to do much more than just sit behind a screen and say, this is it, I've done my job. And this is coming from someone who uses the internet for all her advocacy projects. But there's an offline element that is very important to reconcile with your online work. And that commitment is very real. And losing it means that you end up potentially losing the struggle.
I think it was a brilliant way to sum it up when you said activism isn't a weekend project. In the wake of the current circumstances, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, everything that's going on around the world, what's happening in Beirut right now, have you seen activism change in 2020?
The way I've seen it change is in the fundraising capacity. For example, when you see in Lebanon, I think if this was 2015, there wouldn't be the infrastructure to actually fundraise and raise funds and things like that, and be able to really galvanize the global diaspora and community, whether you're Lebanese or not. Everybody, for example, was when you see the footage and you see that a country was already suffering so much with corruption, with instability, with economic setbacks. I mean, it was already a very traumatizing time for them. Throw on top of that COVID and explosion, it's unheard of, and so many other communities are experiencing very similar challenges, but in different ways, of course. And so the internet enables us to also humanize a lot of what's happening and to really understand what's going on, and where people in Lebanon are reaching out and saying, this is exactly what we need. And here are the, here's a website where people can go, for example, to find some missing people. And there were some people who were able to find or explore or say that this person belonged to this family because this individual, for example, maybe lost their memory in the blast or was in a coma or something like that. And then being able to see a picture and say, hey, this person is alive. I mean, you can see that has really changed. I think a couple of years ago, maybe we would not have been using the internet in this way. I mean, yes, to some extent, but now I think people are a lot more comfortable doing it and are a lot more savvy in how and how they do it. So I think when there's a movement or there's a cause or something like that, it is definitely widespread. And you can see also with Black Lives Matter, there was a significant amount of funding that was raised. Still not enough, still a drop in the bucket compared to many other organizations that aren't, founded by Black individuals, for example. But it has been very different from 10 years ago, for example. They would not have been raising the same amount of funding, and people would not have been comfortable publicly backing those types of movements and fundraising drives and events and things like that. So I definitely think that things have changed for the better, but also for the worse, in terms of the fact that everything is trackable, everything is traceable, everything is surveilled, many things are censored. And so I think we need to look at the pros and cons of every situation to understand that, yes, there's a lot of good things happening, but there's a lot more work to be done.
I was just going to ask about, digital. You've talked about digital privacy and online surveillance being a massive challenge for activism to overcome. Do you personally ever fear for your safety?
Absolutely. I mean, everywhere where you go and you feel somebody's going to take my photo and leak it or something, like, my privacy is very important to me for reasons beyond security. I feel that for me, my anonymity is the only thing that actually enables me to be creative in my advocacy work. Otherwise, I would be I would have a lot of fear, and that fear would be a major barrier to me actually taking any more risks. But I think now with that level of anonymity, and especially Bahrain is a very small country, you walk out the door and people could recognize you. And so that has really been a major reason also why I decided to be physically anonymous, is because I wanted also to protect not just myself, but my friends and family, so that I'm seen with them. People are not associating them directly with my controversial work and saying, hey, this is, a family that is against our morals, and they're doing things for LGBTQ individuals, and they're doing things for religious minorities who go against our beliefs. I don't have to worry about that. As soon as I shut down my computer, I can be a different person and kind of walk out the door and not have to worry about being recognized for my work. But that does worry me, again, is when I do go and I have those speaking engagements, which is very important for me, because that visibility also maintains my work. If people don't know about the efforts that we're taking, then they won't be able to partner with us, sponsor us. For example, Internet Archive, I found, the executive director, I met him at a conference. It's these types of relationships that end up coming to your aid. But at the same time, I always maintained my visibility because I just think it is a big issue when you want to do something, but you feel like you can't because the world is watching every move that you take. And not just the world, but more so than that, your government or other neighboring governments that are allies. Data sharing, people are spreading your information against your will, selling your information against your will. And then we have the issue of the deep fakes, where you didn't do something, but you're made to believe that you've done something or said something because of the type of technology that we have today that is so advanced that puts you in a place where you weren't and makes you say or do things that you didn't. And I won't lie. I mean, that terrifies me. In 12 years ago, I had anticipated that this was going to be the future in which we live in. It was very obvious that this was the direction that the web was taking. And I made it very clear to myself and also to my family that my physical anonymity will be the compromise, that I take in order for me to actually continue my work.
Mm-hmm. So you guys have been in, obviously, this, I shouldn't say business, but you guys are so experienced with activism and online activism. What's the advice that you would give to people to protect themselves when they're sharing information online?
Well, the first thing is definitely researching what apps you're using. If you're using WhatsApp, you could think, well, maybe I can use Signal or something like that. So always having encryption as the default, especially when you're dealing with very sensitive communities. Then there are many ways to find to learn how to encrypt your emails, and it's not going to be rock solid. There's always going to be a way where people can attempt to reveal your information, but if you make it harder for them, they become a little bit less motivated sometimes. So we owe it to ourselves, but more than that, we owe it to the people we communicate with to encrypt our information as much as possible, because we're not just protecting ourselves anymore. We're protecting other people that we communicate with. If, for example, I was charged with a crime or something like that, the first thing that people will do is go through all my emails and see who I was interacting with. And so, I think it's important for us then, and by a crime here, to put things in perspective, I don't mean murdering somebody, but for example, a crime could be a tweet against a minister or something like that. For us, that is what a crime is for the most part, is practicing your right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, access to information. And as much as you can, there are many browsers there that are safer than the typical one. There's the Tor browser. There are many options that you can take outside of, for example, using Jitsi for video calls, things like that. There are options. 10 years ago, this was very difficult. When we try to encrypt our information, you had to go through extreme lengths and you have to go through all this digital security training. And it was very expensive and it was very difficult. So nobody did it, because you had to pay for things and you have to pay for software. And the things that were open source were not very straightforward in the user interface. So when we tell people to use it, they say, I don't even know where to start. I'm barely good enough to use, WordPress. Let alone try to figure out how to encrypt my website and my data and my databases and my servers. It's a lot to ask, and it's also not cheap. When you want to have your dedicated servers that are encrypted and all of that, and have people consistently go back and audit and make sure that you're doing everything that you can. Yes, you can do that as a volunteer, but it would often not happen because people don't have time. This is a big commitment. Especially when you're a small organization. It works for major organizations that are very well known. But when you're a small organization, you're operating with very little networks, very little resources, very little visibility in terms of what other organizations are getting on a global level, which means that there's a lot of things that other people wouldn't pay for that you end up having to pay for to make sure that you're protecting your team and your users and, your members and donors and all of that. But we owe it to ourselves, and again, we owe it to others to take those steps.
So we have so much tech to help protect us. I think it's really interesting how you talk about the importance of design in helping people stay engaged. Why is design so important in your view?
Design is integral to everything that we do because it's the difference between a 500-page PDF document that maybe 2 journalists around the world will read, and a very interactive platform where you can go and engage with the content and actually learn about the issue. So it was very important for us when we started realizing that when we started moving away from long blogs and articles and started moving towards interactive infographics and interactive journeys where, for example, you put yourself in the shoes of a migrant worker. A lot of the time people say, this is not a problem. The kafala system is not an issue because the person can just go to an embassy or the person can. Well, we have a lot of data to show that in those situations, the migrant workers often end up in an even worse situation than when they started with. They're either arrested or their documents are again confiscated away from them. A lot of problems occur, or they're ignored at their embassies and they couldn't, they're homeless. They're effectively homeless and have nowhere to go and they're starving on the streets. So we put together these types of things where we try to alert other people that no, it's not as easy as we'll go and find help, because this is what happens when they go and find help. And after we started doing things like these, we started really increasing our traffic. But not just the traffic, because traffic is a very vain way of measuring your impact. It often doesn't mean anything. It's a useless metric. But it is more, it's what makes it useful when you realize that the people are actually coming and saying, I want to help, I want to be a volunteer. Where can I go to support people with shelter? Or I have an empty apartment that I'm not using. People can go. If there's a domestic worker who needs it, I'm available. So when we started putting together these types of resources, we realized that it was always because we put something together that other people felt good about sharing. And people respond to things that look good because it shows that you've showed the information care, that you care enough to make it look good, that you care enough to make sure that it's packaged in a way that other people can receive it and do something with it. So I think people respond very well to well-designed campaigns.
In the past, you've another interview that I read that I found very interesting, a quote that I really liked. You said you want to live in a world where challenging authority is normal and it's celebrated. In your view, are things getting better?
I mean, I would like to be optimistic about this, but right now, looking at the state of the world, it is not that great, but it doesn't mean that we don't stop going after that goal. I think we are not that much better than where we were when we started 15 years ago. When we look back, we see that there's a lot of similarities with how we started off. But it doesn't mean that there weren't any differences, because there were a lot of positive impact. 15 years ago would have been a very difficult time to come and find a space for LGBTQ community building, for example. And now there is. It would have been a challenging time to connect people with resources. And now there is, because more people are becoming available with their resources and knowing where to go to put them and find them and connecting them. So it's in many ways, it is getting better. But it's a terrifying place to still challenge authority, because we live in countries where their death penalty is still there and political instability is rife and there's corruption everywhere. And the same leaders, for the most part, the same leaders, the same systems, the same ruling powers, the same privilege that enabled so much of this racism and abuse and classism. And so I think there's so much work for us to be doing still. But if anything, this should just encourage others to know that because we have so much work, it's not ever enough to say, I'm done, let's stop. It's important to take the breaks in between so that you can put your work in perspective and see, what can I do that's actually more meaningful or more effective or will have more impact? Or, do I create a movement? Do I join a movement? Is there enough for the type of work that I want to do? And so I think it's a pessimistic outlook, but at the same time, we have to be optimistic, because you can't do this work without being optimistic, and you can't do it without a little bit of sense of humor and a little bit of feeling a little bit of happiness and belonging of doing something like this. Even if the work itself is so traumatic and depressing, we have to find that within us to say, where do we want to end up, and fantasizing about where we want to end up, because that will make you want it to actually get there, and it will make you work harder to want to get there, and not just for you, but for your families and for your future generations. I think we owe it to them as well to say, we did our absolute best, and we try to protect you from the stuff that we're dealing with right now.
So what's next for Majal? You guys have got a lot of stuff going on, but we'd love to hear, what to expect.
Yeah, right now we are hoping to expand Midi Students to Farsi. Midi Students has been doing great amongst Iranian populations, whether in Iran or amongst the Iranian diaspora. So that's great. But we're also hoping to drastically improve our LGBTQ platform. And then migrant rights is also doing so much, especially around migrants and how they've been impacted by COVID-19. And so we have definitely been busy, but we are super excited about, the endeavors in which we're embarking on, because we do feel very passionately about all of these different causes. And we're also making a big effort to help other organizations who may not have been working remotely. So there were a lot of nonprofit organizations that come to us and want to collaborate on encryption and privacy. And so we've been doing a lot of that. It's definitely created a situation in which we're a lot more collaborative than we used to be, perhaps, because now people actually realize, look, there's an organization that's been doing this remotely for 15 years. Let's learn about how they did it and what tools they use and what the expenses realistically are. Because now a lot of people are looking to, upgrade their servers as more and more users are going online, figuring out how to customize their platform so that it's more receptive. And this is something that we do, all the time, every single day, with or without COVID. So now that people have this challenge, they are definitely looking to us and we're looking to others as well. I mean, it's just been a very challenging time, but also a time where we really develop a lot of learning, a lot of opportunities for learning and bypassing challenges together.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Esra'a. It's been really great, really intense.
Thank you.
And I hope one day maybe we can meet in person when COVID's all over. Let's see what happens. Thank you for listening to Can Design Save Us by the Index Project. I'm your host, Lesley Price, and this episode was produced by Sidsel, Kaae, Nørgaard, with music by Kristina, Lilleskov. Join us for the next episode where we'll dive into the paradox of sustainable fashion.